Right, let's talk about some complementary and supplementary theorems and then practice writing some conditional statements with those. So starting with this first diagram, we are told angle 1 is supplementary to angle 2 and 2 is also supplementary to angle A. How would we find the measure of angle 1 and angle 2? So the only angle we're given the measure of is A, and we're told it's 70 degrees. Well, we know A is supplementary to angle 2, which means if I subtract 70 from 180, that gives me the measure of angle 2, which is going to be 110. Okay, great. Now I need to find the measure of angle 1. If 1 is supplementary to angle 2, that means if I subtract 110 from 180, I get 70. And what we notice here now is that angle 1 is congruent to angle A because they have the same measure. So what we've just done is demonstrate this theorem, that if angles are supplementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. All right, let's take a look at our next diagram. F is supplementary to G, H is supplementary to J, and G is congruent to J. So I've got these 4 angles, and what I'm going to mark on my diagram is this here, that G is congruent to J with my tick marks. Now I'm going to give those any kind of arbitrary value. Let's say 30 degrees. And because they're congruent, they're the same. So F is supplementary to G. So if F and G add to 180 and G is 30, that means F is 150. Then H is supplementary to J, which means if J is 30, H is 150. So what we show here now is that F and H are congruent to each other, and you could pick any value for G and J and you would find that that makes F and H congruent. So this is proving this theorem, that if angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. These theorems are also true for complementary angles. If angles are complementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. And if angles are complementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. So with that information in mind, let's write some conditional statements. So these conditional statements are just going to be if-then. So think if I had written my entire paragraph proof and I'm in my definition, my conclusion, this would be the if-then definition statement that I would put at the end of my conclusion. So we're not writing the whole proof, we're just putting the if-then statement that supports our conclusion. So starting here on number 1, the first thing I need to do is correct a small typo. That's not angle XYW, it's supposed to be, or XYZ, it's supposed to be angle XWY. XWY. Okay. So X is complementary to XWY, Z is complementary to YWZ, and then XWY is congruent to YWZ. So I'm going to mark that on my diagram with my tick marks. How do I know that X is congruent to Z? Well, out of the 4 theorems that we just talked about, you can eliminate 2 of them because I'm looking at complementary angles. So that eliminates both of the ones pertaining to supplementary. Now, how many angles am I dealing with? I have 1, 2, 3, 4 angles I'm talking about. For that first diagram, remember, we only had 3 angles. They were supplementary to the same angle. The second diagram, I had 4 angles, and they were supplementary to congruent angles. So if you have more than 3 angles, that is a surefire way to know that you are looking at angles that are complementary to congruent angles. So I'm just going to write this straight from that theorem, that if angles are complementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. Let's look at number 2. 1 is supplementary to 2, 3 is supplementary to 4. If 1 is congruent to 3, how do I know if 2 is congruent to 4? Well, that would be because I've got angles that are supplementary to congruent angles. So if angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. All right, 2 more. Angle 1 is complementary to angle 2, and angle 2 is complementary to angle 3. How do I know 1 is congruent to 3? Well, what I'm looking at here is two angles that are congruent to the same angle, angle 2. I only have 3 angles, and I'm talking about complementary, so if angles are complementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. All right, and last but not least, 1 is supplementary to 2 and 1 is supplementary to 3. How do I know that 2 is congruent to 3? Well, I've got angles that are supplementary to the same angle. So, 3 angles, if angles are supplementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. And that is it.